Presenting Rainbows Do Not Happen at Midnight. This video is in memory of Alexander Waugh, scholar, mentor, and friend who died on July 22nd, 2024. May his legacy live on. We must use critical thinking when evaluating evidence in the Shakespeare authorship question, or SAQ. As the graffiti on the brick wall behind says, thinking is allowed. In his introduction to critical thinking, Jeff Pinn of Northern Illinois University says, critical thinking is making sure we have good reasons for our beliefs. I recommend the series Wireless Philosophy for all viewers to understand more about critical thinking. As Rodgell and Daryl Pleka say in Introduction to Criminal Investigation, Processes, Practices, and Thinking, thinking must illustrate an evidence-based path to forming reasonable grounds for belief and subsequent action. That means in practice, we must adapt our thinking based on principles of criminal investigation. Was the wrong person given credit? Is it possible other persons were involved? Were all likely suspects properly eliminated? Was all relevant evidence found? Was the evidence interpreted correctly? Was the evidence based on a sound method? And finally, was cognitive bias involved in the investigation? I will do a future video on cognitive bias, how to detect it and how to avoid it. A set of premises makes up an argument. Premises are statements that support the conclusion of an argument. They can be either true or false. There are deductive arguments and ampliative arguments. I didn't know about ampliative arguments until I did some research for this presentation. Conclusions are guaranteed in deductive arguments. Conclusions are probabilities in ampliative arguments. Here's an example of a deductive argument. Premise 1. Martha is in the hospital. Premise 2. She is in traction with 2 broken legs. Conclusion. Martha will not go on vacation with her family. If premises 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion must also be true. If it's true that Martha is in the hospital, and if she is in traction with 2 broken legs, then Martha will not go on vacation with her family. Unless, of course, perversely, the family wants to be on vacation with her in the hospital, which is highly unlikely. Premises must connect logically to the conclusion as cumulative evidence for that conclusion. We can say it is a chain of relevant evidence. Note that it has to be relevant. Premises must support the conclusion and be true. They cannot be opinions. Here's an example of an ampliative argument. Premise 1. Martha does not like the outdoors. Premise 2. She has a lot to do at her job. Conclusion. Martha will not go on vacation with her family. There is no guarantee that she will not go on vacation with her family based on these premises. If it's true that Martha does not like the outdoors, then premise 2 is irrelevant. And if it's true that she has a lot to do at her job, it is not relevant to the conclusion. In other words, it doesn't matter if she has a lot to do at her job. If we can supply an alternate conclusion, the argument is not sound. Her family could book a luxury hotel somewhere in a city. So that means that it doesn't matter if she does not like the outdoors. She's not going to be in the woods. We also have to talk about valid and sound arguments. Validity is a relationship between the premises and the conclusion, and it is also a property of arguments. A valid argument may not necessarily be true. If all premises are true and relevant to the conclusion, that's the relationship, and we cannot put forward an alternate conclusion, then the argument is deductive and sound, and the conclusion must also be true. This is what I call the acceptance principle. The conclusion must be supported by the premises as evidence for the conclusion. If A, B, and C are true and the argument is sound, then D must be true. What if you do not know if all the premises are true? If we learn that all the premises are true, then we must accept the conclusion. How do you know if the premises are true? Well, they must fit the argument and be relevant. That means the evidence and the premises must have some connection to the conclusion. They must also be simple. You cannot add point after point after subpoint in any of the premises just to make your argument more sound and deductive. And finally, you can infer the conclusion from the premises. That means you can logically accept that the conclusion is true based on what you know of the premises. There are also formal and informal fallacies. So let's look at a formal fallacy, the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Premise 1, if X, then Y. Premise 2, Y. Conclusion, therefore X. Here's an example. Now, if I'm getting any of these examples wrong, let me know in the comments and I will produce a follow-up video that will correct my slides. Premise 1. Many people with ADHD choose not to drive. Premise 2. George does not drive. Conclusion. Therefore, George has ADHD. This is a formal fallacy because we can get an alternate conclusion because George might not have ADHD and just decide, I don't like driving. Therefore, this is a formal fallacy. Now let's look at an informal fallacy, the fallacy of equivocation. Premise 1, all X are Y. Premise 2, what is Y cannot be Z. Conclusion, therefore no X are Z. Once again, if I'm getting this wrong, let me know in the comments and I will correct it in a future video. Here's the example. Premise 1, all men are literate. Premise 2, women are not men. Conclusion, women are not literate. Please note this example is just for the purpose of illustration and far from what I believe to be true. The content is about literacy, or is it about gender? In any event, you cannot say that women are not literate based on the fact that they are not men. And of course, premise 1 might not be true. Therefore, this argument does not hold. Now we need to talk about correlation. Correlation does not equal causation. Correlation means event A happens immediately before or at the same time as event B. It does not necessarily follow that A caused B to happen. There must be evidence that B was caused by A using logic. If the existence of B depends on A, then A was either a cause or the cause of B. The correlation matters for the existence of B. This brings us to the following. There are two types of correlation, positive and negative. Positive correlations mean the events frequently occur together. A happening when B happens could be coincidence, or there could be an alternate explanation or common cause for B. Here's an example. When there are no clouds in the sky and the sun is up, we get sunshine. Negative correlation means one event will not occur if the other one does. Rainbows do not happen at midnight. It is a physical impossibility. Now we get to the main question. Is the argument deductive and sound or ampliative and unsound? To restate it, is the evidence, are the premises, relevant, probative, distinct, strong, sharp, and well-defined enough to lead us to conclude the Stratford businessman had a writing career? Let's look at some of the premises. The main argument. What is the first premise? The title page to the first folio and many quartos have the name William Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, on them. Premise 2. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon spent some time in London before the first folio was printed and when many quartos were printed. Conclusion. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon wrote the books which have the name William Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, on them. This is a perfect example of an unsound ampliative argument. Someone else with the name Shakespeare or using the name Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, could have written the books. The logical fallacy embedded in this argument is inference from a name or description. Just because the names are similar doesn't mean that the Stratford man wrote the books. This is the secondary argument. This is also an unsound ampliative argument. Premise 1. The plays and poems in the first folio and quartos bearing the name Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, show immense learning and life experience. Premise 2. There are no records that William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon had the advanced education or life experience as shown in the plays and poems. Conclusion. William Shakespeare wrote the books which have the name William Shakespeare on them. Premise 2 does not support the conclusion. And you can argue that, well, all the records are lost, but that's arguing from ignorance. And you could also say, well, it doesn't matter that there are no records of his advanced education, but that's special pleading. If you can have 3 different fallacies inside a simple argument like this, then the argument is definitely unsound. Here's the tertiary argument. Premise 1. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon was a natural genius who did not need the advanced learning or life experience shown in the first folio and quartos. Premise 2. The first folio and quartos have the name Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, on them. Conclusion. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon wrote the books which have the name William Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, on them. Premise 1 may not be true, and it does not logically support the conclusion. And if he was a natural genius, it didn't necessarily mean that he was a natural genius in writing. He could have been a natural genius in blacksmithing, or paper making, or any other trade that he was capable of entering. Here is the full argument. Premise 1. The plays and poems in the first folio and quartos bearing the name Shakespeare show immense learning and life experience. Premise 2. There are no records that William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon had the advanced education or life experience as shown in the plays and poems. Premise 3. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon was a natural genius who did not need the advanced learning or life experience shown in the first folio and quartos. Premise 4. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon spent some time in London before the first folio was printed and when many quartos were printed. Conclusion. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon wrote the books which have the name William Shakespeare on them. Premise 2, Premise 3, and Premise 4 do not logically support the conclusion because we can find an alternate conclusion. Someone else with the name Shakespeare or using the name Shakespeare could have written the plays and poems. We could add the following premises to the argument. Premise 1. A man named William Shakespeare co-purchased the building in Blackfriars. Premise 2. A man named William Shakespeare owned shares in the lease of the second Blackfriars Playhouse. Premise 3. A man named William Shakespeare may have owned shares in the Globe Playhouse as early as 1599. Premise 4. a man named William Shakespeare was listed as receiving payment on behalf of the King's Men Acting Company. Premise 5. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon may have owned property and lent money in London. Conclusion. William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon wrote the books which have the name William Shakespeare on them. The logical fallacy throughout all of this is inference from a name or description. Furthermore, I have purposely prefaced each premise with a man named William Shakespeare. There could have been more than one William Shakespeare. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that there have been at least 3 living at the same time in England. Here is the Stratford/De Vere argument. This is another unsound ampliative argument. Premise 1. The plays and poems in the first folio and quartos bearing the name Shakespeare show immense learning and life experience. Premise 2. There are records that Edward de Vere had the advanced education and life experiences shown in the plays and poems. Conclusion. Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon wrote the books which have the name William Shakespeare, alternately Shake-Spear, on them. Premise 1 and Premise 2 do not support the conclusion because you need evidence that they connect to William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon. The logical fallacy again is inference from a name or description. Now we will look at the anonymous argument. Premise 1 and Premise 2 are about the immense learning and life experience. The conclusion is that William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon gave de Vere permission to use his name on books which have the name William Shakespeare on them. It could be that Shakespeare had nothing to do with those books and the names are just a coincidence. This is again inference from a name or description, and it comes from a doubter, not a Stratfordian. Here is the de Vere argument, and this is another unsound ampliative argument. Plays and poems show immense learning and life experience. There are records that de Vere had the advanced education and life experience. The conclusion is that Edward de Vere wrote the plays and poems in the first folio and quartos that bear the name William Shakespeare. The conclusion is still not sound simply based on premise 1 and 2, which are relevant to the conclusion, because we require more evidence, premises, to make this argument deductive and sound. In other words, there must be something stronger than just education and life experience to connect de Vere to the Shakespeare canon. It could be that someone else with equivalent learning and life experience wrote it. Here's premise 3, just to add something to this argument. The writer Francis Mears put it in writing that de Vere was the best contemporary playwright for comedy. The conclusion is still not sound simply based on premises 1 to 3. Let's add this. The definition for comedy in Mears' time was broader than it is now. It means any type of play. The argument is sounder with the addition of 4, but it's still ampliative because we can supply another candidate in the conclusion. Premise 5 makes the argument more deductive, valid, and sound. Nobles were 5 times more likely to publish drama and poetry anonymously or using a pen name than they were to publish those genres under their own names during the period in question. Of course, the argument is far sounder with the addition of premise 5 because it is absolutely relevant to the conclusion, because we are inferring that William Shakespeare is a pen name. This premise makes the argument much more deductive, valid, and sound. Premise 6. Edward de Vere wrote in a letter he used the name William Shakespeare to publish under. Premise 6 would be the smoking gun evidence needed to fulfill all the criteria to make this a sound, valid, and deductive argument. The first 3 premises are true. The others are speculative. In the absence of proper evidence, we will remove premise 6, writing in a letter that he used Shakespeare as a pen name. More evidence is needed to prove that premise 4 and premise 5 are true to make this a more deductive, valid, and sound argument. We need more evidence to prove that comedy meant something broader in Francis Mere's time than today. And we also have to prove that nobles were 5 times more likely to publish drama and poetry anonymously or using a pen name than they were to publish those genres under their own names during the period in question. These have to have more evidence. All these 5 premises could lead us to make the same conclusion. Without more evidence supporting premises 4 and 5, it is still ampliative and relatively unsound. Of course, none of this matters if your opponents will not listen or use their brains. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.